Hey everybody, grab your Bible and a pencil and a journal and maybe even a cup of coffee and join in on our conversation. But first, I would like for you to write this down. Ruth, chapter 1, verses 19 through 21. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came about when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me."
Hey everyone, welcome to Write This Down with Dot Bowen. My name is Cara. I am Dot's daughter. And every week we sit down together and we have a conversation about God's love, about scripture, about what God might be teaching us. And we are starting a new little series on the book of Ruth. We're going to do 4 weeks talking about each chapter of the book of Ruth. And we're really going to focus a lot on Naomi, who is the mother-in-law of Ruth. So I actually am personally very excited about these conversations, and I hope you are too. So we would love for you to pull up a chair and join in our conversation.
Wow, my goodness. Naomi. Hey, Cara.
She's really sad.
She is something.
So I know you're probably not very excited talking about Ruth, are you?
Yeah.
Or Naomi? Okay. Well, because I've mentioned talking about this a couple times, and you never seemed super excited, and then I finally wore you down, and here we are talking about it.
Nothing is more exciting than talking about a bitter woman. I mean, I just get up in the day and think, wow, can I concentrate on
I didn't say let's talk about a bitter woman, but I did say I think that there's a lot in Ruth. But when we were talking through this a couple months ago, I mentioned when I think of the book Ruth, I relate more to Naomi. Like I see so much more of Naomi's story than I do Ruth's story. I know we're going to talk more about the book of Ruth through Naomi's lens, but that's because Ruth there's definitely a lot just in Ruth and who she is for sure. But I just see it's whenever we read through this, in our yearly reading, which I had forgotten that we had already read through this year. So that's good.
Really.
But yeah, so I just think that there's a lot in Naomi. And I think a lot of times we look over that, but she's the person in the story that I don't know, my eye's always on her.
I don't really know what to say about that because
I don't think there's anything to say about it. It's just,
it's not, I mean, I know, but you're saying I can relate to her. And I think the majority of people that are in this conversation, and myself included, at some point in our lives, we feel exactly like Naomi did. There are some times in our lives we're Ruths to other people. So I do believe that there are definitely so many things that we can learn from. I think that with Naomi and what we're going to talk about is her struggles. I mean, she went and she left her home and was, with her husband and 2 sons because there was a famine. And so she thought, oh, we got to get out of here because we might die. Little did she know that where she was going, there would be a death. It wasn't hers, but it would be her husband and her 2 sons. And so here we pick up the story of what I was just reading. And the people are like, "Oh, Naomi's back," and she's like, "Don't call me Naomi."
Yeah, but I think when I think of Naomi, there's just so much grief in her story, and that's where I think we can, or at least I'll speak for myself. Like I can't relate to losing a husband and losing 2 children. I can't imagine that kind of grief. But for what grief is, and feeling like, I don't know how. I mean, she says, basically, like even if I were to have hope that my life could turn around, like she's kind of saying like but it can't because like earlier in chapter 1, when her daughter-in-laws Ruth and Orpah, are basically deciding whether or not they're going to stay with her. She's basically like, even if I were to have hope, this isn't gonna Like I don't have a great story to look forward to. And I think that is like a real moment in grief where it's like, even if you're trying to hold on to hope, it's kind of like, I don't even know how to hold on to hope in this moment. And I think that's like very real, you know?
So it is very real. And the fact that there are a couple of things that are very real, what you're talking about. She is extremely grief stricken. I mean, she's lost a husband and 2 sons. She's in a country that she's left home. She thought her life was going to be different. It wasn't. She thought, that maybe, by her going to Moab, they would, have a different situation because they were leaving Bethlehem. They were leaving their home thinking that things were going to be better. So often when life doesn't turn out the way we think it should, we do deal with a grief. We do deal with a loss. We mourn, whether it's whatever it is. Like when we have a unmet expectation, that's where it's really dangerous. And it is a loss, but it's an unmet expectation is a loss. And I think that's where we can say a lot of people, or there may be somebody in this conversation that has lost a husband, has lost 2 sons that are listening to this. And that is it's just hard. Life is, hard when you lose someone that you love, especially through death. And then there are people that are going to be on this conversation that they haven't, like you said, they haven't experienced that, but they have seen a death to a dream. They've seen a death to what they thought, their life's going to be. And I think in both situations, who can tell the person that feels like their dreams and what life was going to be a death to their dreams, who can tell that person how to mourn and how long to mourn, and that, you can't just say, well, get over it. At least you didn't lose a husband and 2 children. But then you look at someone that's lost a husband and 2 children, and they say, you get over it because, you don't know what it's like to lose a husband and children. So we all know that we're coming into life and we're living out our story in our life, and it's not always the way that we think it's going to, and pain is pain, and it's hard to sit with someone who has gone through so much death and so much loss and so much grief. It's just as hard to deal with someone that is having to deal with a death to a dream, because you can't change either one of them. You can't change either one of them. And Ruth is not trying to change the situation with Naomi. But what is very important that we have to bring up is that life is hard. And whether you have Jesus or you don't have Jesus, you're going to have to deal with death, sickness. And we've talked about this on numerous times. But if you don't deal, or you and I both, not just you personally, but if people do not deal with the grief in a way that is godly, in a way that I believe you have to really, the only way I can even imagine dealing with any kind of hard, difficult situations in life without the Holy Spirit. If we don't deal with it and face what's really going on in our hearts, we're going to end up bitter. And I think that with Naomi, with what she was saying, when people were like, "Oh, yay, people, Naomi's back," and she said, "Don't call me that." That's a person that's dealing with a lot of bitterness, and she tells you why she's bitter, because she's blaming God. And there's one thing: people get bitter. They blame their ex. They blame their ex-wives. They blame their ex-husbands. They blame their doctors. They blame someone that might have, caused an accident. We blame everybody to a certain point. And then if that doesn't get us relief, then we begin to blame God. And I think that that's a typical thing, because you know that whether or not God had anything to do with her husband and sons dying, we don't know what God was doing in Naomi's life. We just know where Naomi is. And it's whether or not she's going to, and how she's respond to it. We can see that she's very bitter because she says, God has dealt with me very bitterly. She said, I laughed full, but I'm coming back empty. And I find it ironic. She doesn't really applaud and say, my life is really good because of God. Now she's only saying, and this is what
she does.
does.
She said that she left full, and she said that was because of the Lord. So I think she does in some way.
Well, I mean, I guess she acknowledges it, but look how much she spent telling you how bad
she acknowledged it.
God is. Yeah, she did. But I just think that when you're bitter, it's hard to see the goodness that God has done. Now, we know the whole story. We know all of the story. She does not. She's just living at this moment, and she doesn't know what God is going to do. So the only thing she can see right now, and what you were saying, she didn't seem hopeless, is that the only thing that she could see right now is what was right then, that moment of time, or what has happened.
But I guess I don't think that she is as full of bitterness, because if she were, I don't think she would have seen what happens in chapter 2 or 3, which I know we'll get there. But there's an opportunity that happens, and she sees it. She's like, wait, the Lord has done this. And so I think if she was so overcome.
She maybe but she was very, very bitter. And she says, I know. Bitter.
I'm just saying, I think that she went through a process.
Right.
And I'm saying, so in chapter 1,
chapter 4,
definitely. But the point I'm trying to point out is there's hope. If you are in a bitter place, there's still hope to get out of that, is what I'm trying to point out. Is
you don't have to stay in bitterness.
No, I know. And that's what I'm saying is you see this bitterness, but as the story goes on, you can see how she clearly has some sort of softness still left in her heart, or she wouldn't have seen the Lord come through as he did as the story went on. When your heart is so hard, it doesn't matter what God is going to, you're not going to see God or want to see God at all. So there had to have been some element of softness in her heart, even when she was full of bitterness in chapter 1, or she wouldn't have seen, the Lord provide. So I think that's what I'm saying is I think that there is, if you're finding yourself consumed with bitterness, bringing that to the Lord and letting him soften your heart, you know what I mean? And then that's when you can start to see how the Lord will work. I mean, she didn't, there's something that had to have happened. Maybe it was being back in Bethlehem and being surrounded by people who love, because when she left Bethlehem, she was in a foreign country that didn't worship the Lord. And so maybe being back in Bethlehem, I don't know, it just seemed like there had to have been something that began to soften her heart. And it could even been maybe that Ruth was around her, because I think when you're
that's
grieving,
what I was going to say.
I think when you're grieving, when someone says I'm going to sit with you in this, I'm going to be with you in this, because grieving people are not very much fun. I mean, because you're grieving. So it's it's not like she's having a party all the time, but Ruth being no, I'm going to choose to stay with you, even though you're bitter and you're grieving and there's hard going on. And I think that probably helped her heart too, to soften her heart, is, she wasn't completely alone.
So a bitter person is very negative and very consumed of themselves. That's just the way it is. And so, nothing is good, nothing's right, and like you said earlier, she said, you need to go on, because told the daughter-in-law, it's if I had a child now, you're not going to wait until the child grows up.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
To be my daughter-in-law. Yeah.
She was even if there was hope, this is still not
even if I had a child. Yeah. Even if I had a child, there's hope. But she thought that was because of the children, not having the children, that she didn't have any hope. And her only hope to the daughter-in-laws, to have a relationship with the daughter-in-laws, was to be able to have a child. And she knew she wasn't going to be able to do that.
Because that was the culture.
Yeah.
And so I don't have another son that I could give you to marry.
And even if I did, you're not going to wait around for it. But as we see, as the story goes, it is Ruth that makes a plan. And that's next week. We'll talk about that. But it was Ruth that said, I will go. She's the one that had enough insight. And she wasn't even Jewish. She's a Moabite. And so here's this pagan woman that, doesn't even know about the Jewish culture. But she sees that Naomi is hurting.
Wait, what do you mean?
Because when we get into the Kingsman Redeemer, as we get on into the story.
No, that was Naomi that saw that.
Ruth starts it, and Ruth starts the conversation. Ruth does not know anything about Kinsman Redeemer or any of that. Naomi does bring it up later, but right now, we're talking about chapter 1, where Ruth is at this moment that is very bitter. And
Naomi is bitter.
Yeah, Naomi is very bitter. And so here we are, we know that, like you said, Ruth clung to Naomi and said, I'm not going to, leave you. And, she says this famous statement that a lot of people have at weddings, where you go, I go, or, your God will be my God. And I think that I think that Ruth loved Naomi. I don't think Naomi at this moment was probably a lot of fun to be with, but I believe that God was working in Ruth. I believe that God was working in Ruth to get Ruth to stay. One of the other daughter-in-laws left. And we do know that God does use Ruth, but right now, just at this very moment, I believe that God gave Ruth the desire to stay. I don't think Naomi knew what was going to happen. Ruth did not know what was going to happen. They were going to die together. She said, you die, I die, you go, I go. So at this very moment, this grief, when you're bitter and you're so mourning and you're not, being able to even see how God is working, of course you're going to turn on God, because right now, at this moment, doesn't mean she's going to stay there, but at this moment, that's where she is. And I believe that God began to work in Ruth. I believe he works in Ruth, and that's why the whole chapter is about Ruth. But I don't think Naomi knows it, and I don't think Ruth knows it at this time.
No, I agree with that. I was just saying,
there's a lot of going on that we don't know.
Yes, I don't know why I feel like we're arguing about this, because I think, okay. I think it just shows, like, when you're in such a dark place that Naomi was in, having people around you helps. I mean, it's similar. It's like 100%. What we talked about last week. It was 2 weeks ago with the church. And I think that's like, whoever God may call, like, it could just be someone sending you a text or just like saying like, hey, you're on my mind. Or if someone is on your mind, and then you reaching out to them or whatever. But I think when you see how bitter Naomi is, and as the story goes on, I know we'll get there, her heart softens. I think it is because of how God used these people, like whether it's the other women who were in Bethlehem who welcomed her, and Ruth, because I don't know. I mean, God uses people. Again, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, where it's like Naomi may not have, well, of course she wouldn't have gotten to where she gotten without Ruth because of how the story plays out. But I just mean like how God used Ruth in Naomi's life to really bring hope. I mean, I know God's our hope, but I just, like he used Ruth in the story of Naomi. But I think that's like such a beautiful thing, because I'm just imagining, again, I don't know the depth of the grief that she's going through, but I mean, I'm grieving in this current moment, and I'm thinking of the people who send a text or who know I'm having a hard time and who reach out. It's like, those are it helps, it helps, like bringing a little bit of light into the darkness. And so that's where I think, like, sometimes we look at Ruth where it was this, like, definitely was the Lord, and she was not even a Jew, but she obviously believed in God and said, and
she obviously loved Naomi.
Yeah. And so, and she may have come to know and love the Lord because of Naomi, because Naomi was Jewish and Ruth was not. So she met Ruth when she left Bethlehem, when she left when she was in the Israelites. Yeah. So, but I think that shows, like, Naomi had to have had, before all the horrible things happened, she had to have loved the Lord, because I think that was what drew Ruth to God. I don't think Ruth would have known about God any other way. I mean, maybe it was through, I guess we don't know this for sure, but I'm just saying, like, there's a very good chance that
I'm
Ruth
sure her
loved the Lord.
Father-in-law.
Yeah, like they had to have talked about God and Yahweh and the wonders, all the things that had happened up until that point, the Red Sea and all the going to the Promised Land, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I'm sure
they talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I think Ruth did a very sacrificial move in loving Naomi by staying with her. But I think, like, obviously there's like a much bigger picture where it's like, I see it more as like saving Naomi than it is Ruth, because of how dark of a place Naomi was in, you know?
And definitely at that period of time, I mean, this right now, this chapter 1, you know, because we're not going to talk about chapter 2 yet, but right now, just where she is, Ruth makes a choice. I think God was working and prompting on Ruth to stay with Naomi. I think that they had developed a relationship. I mean, just because Naomi was grieving wouldn't mean that Ruth would stay unless there was a relationship there. So I think obviously they were close, but so was the other daughter-in-law. But then she ends up leaving and going. I believe the fact that Ruth was so determined to stay with Naomi, and Naomi was so determined not to let her, you know, they had to have a strong relationship to be able to work through that. And but then I think God did all of that. I think God prompted them. I think God, you know, stepped into the situation because we know that he does, because we know the end of the story. But they did have a choice. And with Naomi, she had a choice to either go and be bitter. Ruth had a choice to go back to her, you know, homeland, or go with Ruth. And they had a thing. And I think a lot of the times, sometimes we think when we're so in so much grieving, we hit a wall. We feel like there's not something to do. Like there's, you know, like I just going to sit here in my grief. And nobody can tell you how long, you should.
You don't want to
move forward.
I mean, you don't have, well, no, you may want to move forward. I'm just saying you may not have the energy. It may be the best thing. You just got to put one foot in front of the other.
But a lot of people don't. And so I think that that's where God is building on a relationship that Ruth must have had with God, beginning with, and certainly building on a relationship that she had with Ruth.
That's what I'm saying. Like, clearly there's years prior to this, because Ruth is not going off of Naomi's relationship with the Lord right now, because Naomi's in such a bitter place that she's not exactly, like you're saying, she's not exactly praising the Lord. So Ruth talking about the Lord, like clearly this is coming from Naomi, you know, years prior to all of this. That was the point that I was trying to point. But I do think that to say that there is a difference, because I know we've talked about grief and bitterness, but there's a difference between, you can, like I mentioned, like I'm grieving some things right now deeply, but I don't feel bitter. And I think that you can grieve without bitterness.
Absolutely.
And so I think, and that's where there is a moment with Naomi where it shifted, like her grief took a turn into bitterness. So much so that she named herself that. So it was not just something, her bitterness wasn't just something she was feeling, that it was like, she felt like it was her. Like, this is who I am now. Like, she was just resolved into, I'm just bitter and, you know, everything's terrible.
You have to deal with your grief. If you don't, then it runs into bitterness. I think that's a given. I think that's experience. People know that. If you don't deal with it and walk through it and ask God to step into those grief and those mourning and those moments of those dark nights and those tears, if you don't, you know, run to Jesus in that, I think that, you know, you're really going in a very dangerous place, because I think you do turn bitter. But I do believe that maybe when Naomi got there, maybe Naomi was doing better. I haven't talked to Naomi about this, but maybe, you know, she got up enough energy to move forward, to leave. She left.
She did. Yeah.
She clearly left. And maybe when she got back to her home, it hit a wound. It hit that moment of, oh, when I was here, I had my husband, so now she's reminded of the loss again. And I think that's part of that. I think that's part of grieving. We're having to deal with, it's not just one moment of time, it's over a period of time when it comes to your mind, or you're, you know, in a situation where your remembrance and...
Yeah. Well, I don't think grief is linear. Like, you're not, you know, it's not just on one plane where it's like, okay, step by step, and here's, you know, like you said, like, there's no time frame, there's no, like, you know, one way to do it. But I think, I mean, even her going back to there, maybe she was even dealing with, like, if I hadn't have left, would this have happened? Like maybe there's regret or shame, or
maybe all these friends with their husband. Maybe all these friends were she and her husband's friends. Maybe she was reminded of her sons when she walked down the street of something that they, as little boys with her. I don't know, but that's the way life is. Is that where it's not just one moment of time to say, okay, I'm going to get over this, but it's a process, and it means that whether you're, with Naomi, she was having to deal with it when she was in Moab, and then now she's gone back home. Now it brings up a whole different layer of that, because that's where her boys were born, and that's where, her husband was.
I'm sure there was even an element of fear, because in that day, women didn't have a means of living. Like they were really dependent on whether their husband or their sons. And that was a lot of, even Ruth choosing to stay with Naomi. She was really saying, like, I'm choosing to not have a means of living. I'm not going to have a husband to take care of me. That's what I'm saying. Like, she wouldn't have any, I'm sure there was how are we going to survive? How are we going to eat? How are we going to have shelter? There's all those logistical and fundamental things that they didn't probably know how it was going to work out. And so I think, part of me, I'm like, I don't really blame Naomi in a sense. I don't know how I would react if I was in that. That's a terrifying situation. I would hope that I wouldn't be bitter, but I don't know. Maybe I would if I was, everyone close to me had died and I'm having to, figure out life on my own.
I know a lot of people that is in that situation and bitter is if you don't deal with the grief.
I know. I'm just saying, I don't know. We don't know how we would respond. We can so easily be like, Naomi.
It's easy for us to say.
Come on, trust the Lord. You've seen him. You heard about the stories of him parting the Red Sea. But it's I don't know. I might be bitter. But I think one thing that helps not become bitter out of your grief, along with what you're saying, obviously bring the Lord into it and praying, and sometimes I just have to have worship music on just to help my mind, because sometimes if there's dull silence, your mind may not go well. So it's sometimes there's those practical things where it's just keeping worship music on, or having someone that to reach out to who will point you to Jesus. But I know I've said this to you where I'm I don't know how to grieve without gratitude, because I think that is, if there was one thing that I would say that has kept me from bitterness, it would be gratitude. And I'm not grateful for what's happened necessarily. What you're grieving, Naomi wouldn't be grateful that she's lost her
and God
sons
doesn't
and husband.
And God doesn't say to be grateful for that.
No, but there's something to be grateful for.
Yeah.
There's something, whether that's the fact that she could even go back to Bethlehem, or that Ruth was staying with her. Yeah.
She's got her health.
Yeah. That I was going to say, she's breathing another day, or, there's something. I was going to say she has shoes on her feet, but maybe she didn't even have shoes on her feet. I don't know. But but I think the gratitude really helps pull us through grief and keeps us from bitterness.
100%.
Because it's keeping your eyes on, it's another way of keeping your eyes on the Lord, because I don't think you can be super, at least for me, I'll speak for myself. I don't know that I could be grateful in grief if it wasn't for the Lord. That's the Holy Spirit. That is not me. That's not my flesh.
Right. That's not humanly. And I think gratitude gets you to look at God. I think gratitude looks at what you do have, and bitterness looks at what you've lost. I think that is where, we've talked about this on several podcasts before, a different perspective. It's just changing your eyes. It's just changing the way that you view. I think gratitude does it. I think gratitude is just taking a moment and be thankful for what you do have. You don't have to be thankful for what you lost, but you can be thankful.
There's something.
There's something. And I do believe that there is, in my situation, and I'm just going to speak for me, that, even when my parents were dying, and, when I've lost some other people that I love very dearly, I could see God's hand in that. Whether it was they didn't suffer very long, or whether they didn't know, or they were even in a coma, they didn't even know. I remember thinking that I was grateful that my dad didn't know that I changed his diapers, because I thought he wouldn't be able to handle that. Now, that's a very, hard thing to go through as a daughter, but I do believe that, like you're saying, that gratitude is a pathway. I definitely think it's a pathway out of protection of being bitter. And I think, and that's what I was trying to say from the very beginning, is that we're all going to grieve, but it's how we deal with the grief and mourning. And if we're not careful and we don't, like you said, you told me this the other day, how much you have learned how grief and gratitude, how they're connected. And I think,
it's holding both. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't make the pain less, but I think it helps move your feet forward. Like go back to Bethlehem this episode. Yeah. I think it keeps, but your feet moving forward in the sense of like with the Lord, like I'm like staying in the room with God. Like I'm not, it helps your heart stay soft. I think that's it and I think it helps. I think a lot of times with bitterness, there's an entitlement and, shaking your fist at God of like, like this isn't fair. You deserve. Yeah. It's like, this is like, you should have done differently. And I do wish things were going differently or went differently, but I don't feel entitled. And I think that's because of keeping my heart attuned, like with gratitude and keeping it toward the Lord, is because I'm like, you have done so much for me. Like even if I don't love what you're doing, I still can acknowledge that you have done so much for me. And it's like a very, it sounds like I'm not saying like it sounds like what I'm saying, counteracts, but it doesn't. I think it's holding both things. And I think I've just learned, I'm like, I don't know how to,
I think I'm
grateful for it, but it's,
I think you can grieve and have gratitude at the same time.
Yeah. I think there may be other ways, but that's the only way that I know that has kept me from feeling bitter.
And I've heard a lot of people say that, but I will say this, at the moment, however you're feeling the pain, anybody, whatever pain you're feeling right now, anybody, I do believe that gratitude eases the pain. I don't think you know it because pain is pain and all you can feel right now is pain. But if you didn't have gratitude and you didn't have the Lord, the pain probably would be worse because I believe that God I think He is a comforter. I think He gives peace. And I think, just because God's a comforter doesn't mean God is peace. It doesn't mean that you're not going to feel, discomfort or turmoil or anything like that. You feel that. But the level of it, again, I mean, I've looked at so many people just this week and think, how do you go through that without Jesus? Yeah. How do you do that? So I think that that's one of the things that right now when, of course, when you're hurting and it's hard for you to see or think you could feel even worse, but I believe you could because I believe.
Well, and it's hard. And this is where Naomi is. And I think you can see that, like, this doesn't mean you're bitter, I don't think, but it's hard to see, like, she couldn't see a good way out of her situation. Like that was a lot of what earlier in chapter 1, where she's like, even if I were to get married again and have children, that's going to be in 20 years, but she's basically saying that like, yeah, I guess there's hope, but there's really not because there's no, like, she couldn't see a way that God could redeem her story, that God could restore what had been broken. And where I'm at, I feel that. I'm like, I don't know. But I think, again, what keeps you moving through grief and not becoming bitter is, even if I think I have to remind myself over and over again, I don't know how you're going to do this, but that's not my job. You don't have to, you're not asking me to figure it out. You're not asking me to know what tomorrow's going to look like. You're not asking me to know how you're going to answer this prayer, or do this miracle, or redeem this thing, or restore this thing, or, whatever it may be, heal this or that. He's just asking to just like rest in Him.
For one thing, you don't know, and none of us know what God's going to do because we don't know what God's going to do.
I know.
We don't know that we have tomorrow. So, and I think with Naomi, she was really thinking about Ruth, like, why go with me? I don't think, I feel, I don't know this, Cara, but I sense, and when I read this, I sense Naomi, she's just dead inside. So for her to even like I think that's what bitterness does. I think it causes you to feel dead inside, and you just don't feel anything. And
she's empty. She said that.
She's empty, right? And so I think that for her as well is that she was talking about Ruth. Like, we're not going to be this. Our relationship is not going to be the same. I don't have a husband. I don't have another child.
Well, so she's saying you're doomed to this, because even if there were hope that I would marry someone else and have another child, like, that's not going to be for a long time.
It's not going to help you any. But I don't think she's even thinking that her life. I don't even think that was ever even an option in her mind, that there's no hope to move forward. I don't think she wanted to move forward. I don't think she had any hope to move forward. You're right. But I don't think she feels like the relationship with that Ruth, that would be the one. Like, she's lost all the other relationships. This one relationship that she does have, she just like, I don't even want that either. There's nothing that I can do to offer you. And that's why, Ruth says, well, I'm going to go wherever you go. Like, you don't have to offer me anything. If you die, I die. If you starve, I'll starve. I think what Naomi was trying to say to Ruth was, like, I don't have anything to give you.
But I think that, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that is something that the Lord used to soften Naomi's heart, because to say, like, I don't have anything to offer you, like, whether you're grieving or bitter or both, if you're saying, I don't have anything to offer you, and for someone to say, like, I'm in it with you, like that,
I'm staying. Mm-hmm.
I don't think, like, you would have to be a robot for that not to soften your heart to some degree. I mean, you may still be bitter toward the Lord. You may still, there's still going to be a process, but that would have to, to be like, oh, what, like, even if it was later on, but for someone to, stick with you through that and say, like, I'm still in it. Like, I still love you. I'm still going to be here next to you. I love your God. You may not love him very much right now, but I love him. Yeah. So I think that had to have impacted Naomi, because she's human.
Obviously,
like, that would be, which I think is really a sweet moment for sure.
Yeah, I think just trying to step into Naomi's situation, personally, I think you feel alone. You feel like nobody cares, nobody's there. You're all caught up in yourself. You just, that's what bitterness does. You're just wrapped up in yourself. You're angry. You're mad at God. You don't feel like you don't want to have a relationship with God. You don't trust him. And I do believe the fact that Ruth consistently stayed there. I don't know how long it took for this to soften Naomi. We do know that she gets softened and begins to, Ruth brings up, I almost feel like I see Ruth going, well, now that we're here, what could we do? What could we do? And I'm sure Naomi's like, I don't even want to think about it. But then she does, they do have a plan.
Ruth is being Jesus to her. I mean, I know they don't know Jesus in this point in Israel's history, but that's what she's doing. She's being in the hands and feet of Jesus to Naomi in that moment, and loving her and helping her be like, because sometimes when you need someone to be like, okay, let's just go for a walk. Let's just go, let's go do this, or let's go, you need that sometimes. And that, I think, that's okay.
Yeah. Because I think too, obviously it says, that Bethlehem was all stirred up because they were there. I mean, all these people, they must have been friends of Naomi's.
Well, they seem I read it as they're excited. I don't know if they are.
Right. I mean, I don't know either. Like, what's going on. And I think probably a lot of it is like, what's happened? Naomi, she's back and she's got this girl and she's, she's the Moabites but where's her son? So there's probably a lot of stuff. There's no such thing as social media at the time. And so they couldn't post it.
Yeah, maybe they didn't know.
And so they didn't know what was going on. But the fact that she lashed back at them and said, don't even call me Naomi, because in her mind, I'm not that same person. I'm not who you think it is. My life's not the same. My life's pretty much over with. And I do believe that that's a symptom that you're going toward bitterness. And I think when you get there, you're very empty. And yes, she had Ruth. And yes, we know that God's prompted Ruth, but she also had probably these people too. And she had a place to go back. But like you said, that's what gratitude would show you. But when you're hurting and you're just so bitter because your life's not what it is. And when you're hurting, you can make a plan. When you're hurting, you can, cry a lot, but you feel like, well, you know what, today I'm just going to get up, or, well, today I'm going to shower, or today I'm just going to wash my hair. I mean, you can do that. But when you're bitter and angry, your heart is so hard. Good things could happen. And I'm very thankful that God has stepped in, and we know God's going to do something amazing, but she doesn't know that and she can't see that. But I do believe that as we learn from this, we have to be careful. We have to look at that and say, God, protect me from getting there. She says that the Almighty has afflicted me. God doesn't afflict them. Her circumstances did. Her circumstances and her life has changed, but she turns on God. And I'm sure Ruth thought, well, this isn't the God you've talked about over all these years. But at this moment, her view of God is horrible. And so why wouldn't you be discouraged? Why? I mean, you're going toward a really very dangerous position. And so I think for whoever's listening to this conversation, and for you and for me, we have to be careful that we do know the heart of God, and that maybe I don't like my circumstances, and maybe I don't know why her sons died, and I don't know why her husband died, but they did. And I just feel like God is, there. He's provided Ruth, and Ruth's not leaving. And then she goes back and she goes home. And instead of feeling, well, at least I'm back home, it's not home to her because her husband's not there, her son's not there, and she can't really even enjoy that. And I think the best and the first thing we have to do is to ask God, am I bitter? And then we have to ask God, do I have the right view of you? Am I thinking that you're out to punish me? And that's exactly what Naomi is like. God is punishing me. But God, there's nowhere in the scripture at all that says that God punished them. Job said that his soul was bitter. But we do know that Job's a whole different story. And Satan has had permission to do some things and rob and take away from Job. But as far as Naomi's concerned, we don't know why her sons died. We don't know why her husband died. But the bitterness comes when you think that God's out to punish you. And you have to be very, very careful. God's not after you. The only person that I feel like scripture ever talks about that God is forsaken has been Jesus when sin was brought on him. Now, Jesus would remove himself, his presence and stuff when his people sinned. But as soon as they repented, he was right there. He was right back. And we're going to see that this, just because this is the way the story is right now, doesn't mean this is the way the story is going to be. God is in the business of writing our stories. And I love this. One of the things that I was reading about it called the story of Ruth a love story. And you read the first chapter, there's not a whole lot of love we got going on here, other than Ruth, wanting to stay with Naomi. But, it takes place at a very difficult time and during the period of the judges. And life, even her environment, her circumstances, her people were under really some hard times. And so, I'm not trying to throw Naomi under the bus. I could definitely be there easy. I'm just saying for our conversation as we begin is how do we protect ourselves from that? It's easy for you and I to say, oh, Naomi, hang on, because you're not going to believe what God's going to do, because we've read that last chapter, but we haven't read the last chapter of your life. We've not read the last chapter of my life, or whoever's listening. So we can look at and we can say, oh yeah, we can praise God right now because we know how this story ends. Well, I think we can praise God because we know how it ends because we read Revelation. We win. But right now, when we're living in our lives, we just have to be very careful that we don't allow the grieving and the mourning to get us to turn our backs on God. I've seen it way too many times. And it all stems from, do I know the heart of God? I may not understand him. I may not know why he does what he does, but I know that he's good. I know that he loves me, and I know that he sent a son for me.
Well, and the story isn't over.
And the story's not over. Right. So that's where I think, as we continue the conversation next week, is where we pick up, like, how does God begin a new story? How's he about to work in Naomi's life that is a new chapter? What's he going to do with Ruth? How's that going to change? Because it does. And that's because they are underneath the umbrella and the sovereignty of God.
Thanks for listening. I'm so glad that you could be a part of our conversation. To continue the conversation, you can find Dot on social media at .bowen or visit her website, dotbowen.com. Subscribe, like, and share with your friends, and we will see you next week on Write This Down with Dot Bowen.